The day Nora Ashby buried her mother, the landlord came to collect the rent. She hadn't finished washing her hands from the grave digging when she heard the knock. 3 hard raps, the kind a man makes when he already knows the answer to his question and is only asking as a formality. She opened the door, still wearing her black dress, still holding the damp cloth she'd used to wipe down the kitchen table after the neighbors left. Mr. Hatch stood on the step with his hat in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. 2 months, he said, not a question. Nora looked at the paper. It had numbers on it she already knew by heart. Her mother had been sick for 8 months. The garden hadn't been enough. Nothing had been enough. I need 2 weeks, she said. Hatch looked at her the way men look at women when they've already decided the outcome and are just waiting for the woman to catch up. He tucked the paper into her hand, tipped his hat, and left without another word. She stood in the doorway of the only house she'd ever known and read the numbers until they stopped meaning anything at all. There wasn't much to sell. A good oak table. Her mother's sewing kit. 2 hens that had stopped laying in October. She sold the table for less than it was worth to a woman 2 streets over who'd always admired it. She kept the sewing kit. The hens went to a farm on the edge of town, traded for a ham she ate slowly over the course of a week, rationing it like she was crossing a desert. She was 24 years old. She had no father, no siblings, no husband, and, as of a cold Thursday in November, no home. She had $12, a traveling trunk she'd inherited from an uncle she barely remembered, and the kind of practical stubbornness that her mother used to call a gift, and her mother's neighbors called a difficult personality. The notice board outside the general store in Brechin, Ontario, was where she found it. A card, neatly written in a hand that suggested the person who wrote it was either very careful or very lonely, seeking a capable woman for household management at a working cattle operation in the Northwest Territories. Room, board, fair wages. References not required. Respond to G. Marlowe, Dunmore Station. She read it twice. Then she took it off the board, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. She wrote that same evening. A short letter. Honest. She said she had experience managing a household, that she was not afraid of work or weather, and that she was available immediately. She did not mention that she was nearly out of money. She did not mention that she had nowhere else to go. She mentioned the things that were true and useful and left the rest alone. A reply came in 11 days. Also short, also honest. Arrived Dunmore Station, 2nd week of January. Ask for Marlowe at the feed store. GM. No mention of wages beyond fair. No mention of what the work actually involved. No mention of anything that would answer the questions gathering at the back of her mind. She bought a train ticket with 7 of her remaining dollars and packed her trunk. The train ride west took 4 days. The landscape changed in a way that felt personal, like the land itself was trying to say something she wasn't quite fluent enough to hear. The prairies opened up flat and enormous and swept clean by wind, and by the time the train pulled into the small depot at Dunmore, Nora had the unsettling feeling that she had arrived somewhere the world took seriously. The cold was different here. Ontario winters were damp and gray and miserable. This cold was dry and absolute, the kind that didn't argue with you. She stepped off the train into it and felt it immediately in her lungs. The feed store was 2 buildings down from the depot. A man behind the counter looked up when she came in, assessed her in the way people in small places assess strangers, and said, "You the woman from the letter?" "I'm looking for Marlowe," she said. He nodded toward the back. "He's loading." She found him in the alley behind the store, stacking feed sacks onto a wagon with the mechanical efficiency of someone doing a thing they'd done 1,000 times and had stopped thinking about. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader across the shoulders, somewhere in his late 30s, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in disapproval some years ago, and hadn't moved much since. He was not unkind looking. He was not particularly kind looking either. He noticed her and stopped. "Mrs. Ashby?" he asked. "Miss," she said. "Nora Ashby." Graham Marlowe looked at her for a moment, in a way that was less rude than it was assessing, like he was calculating something. Then he nodded, the way men nod when they've decided to move forward with a plan they're not entirely sure about. "Wagon's nearly loaded," he said. 2-hour drive. Dress warm." She dressed warm. They didn't speak much on the drive. The land was flat and white and immense, and she spent most of the journey looking at it while he drove with the quiet focus of a man navigating somewhere he knew too well to be interested in the scenery. At one point she asked about the work. He said household management, cooking, some bookkeeping if she was able. "I'm able," she said. "Good." That was the extent of it until they turned off the main road onto a track that led between 2 stands of bare poplar, and she saw the farm. It wasn't what she'd expected. She hadn't known exactly what to expect, but whatever she'd been picturing, this wasn't it. The main house was large and solidly built, timber and stone, 2 stories, the kind of house that had been built to last. But everything around it had the look of a thing that had been fighting to hold itself together for a long time. fences leaning, a barn door hanging loose on one hinge. The woodpile was low for January. The yard had the feel of a place where someone had stopped paying attention. Graham pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. Before he could move, the front door opened and two faces appeared in the gap. A girl, maybe 10 years old, round-faced and watchful. And just behind her, a boy. Same age, same dark eyes. Twins. She hadn't known about twins. The girl spoke first. "You're late." "Roads were slow," Graham said, climbing down. "Nora, this is my daughter Meg and my son Percy." Meg looked at Nora with the frank suspicion of a child who has learned that new adults in her life tend to bring complications. Percy looked at his boots. "You're going to cook?" Meg asked. "Among other things," Nora said. "The last one burned the porridge 3 days in a row and cried about it every time." "I haven't burned porridge since I was 9, Nora said. Meg considered this. Percy still hadn't looked up. They went inside. The house was cold in the way of a place where the fires hadn't been properly managed. The rooms caught on the edge of warm, but not quite there. The kitchen was large and might once have been inviting. Now it was cluttered and tired, dishes stacked without much care, the stove needing a serious clean. She could see what the house had been before it started losing the battle with time. Graham showed her the room at the top of the stairs. Small, clean enough, with a window that looked out over the east field. A single bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall for her coat. "Supper's usually at 6, he said from the doorway. "If you need anything in the first few days, ask Meg. She knows where things are." He left before she could ask any of the questions still lining up inside her. She unpacked her trunk, hung her second dress on the hook, set her mother's sewing kit on the washstand where she could see it, and told herself this was manageable. She'd lived through worse than a cold kitchen, and a man who used 12 words where 30 would have been normal. She went downstairs and started on supper. By the time the stove was going properly and the smell of salt pork and potato had reached the stairs, Meg appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I set the table," the girl said, with the tone of someone offering evidence in their own defense. "Thank you," Nora said. "We don't need someone to take care of us. I can see that." Nora turned from the stove. "You've been managing. I'm not here because you've been failing. I'm here because your father is doing 3 people's work and something had to change." Meg looked at her for a long moment. "The others said things like that too. How many others have there been?" 3, in 2 years. Nora turned back to the stove. "I'm not leaving in 2 years, she said, which was true at least in the sense that she had nowhere else to go. Supper was quiet. Graham ate with the focused efficiency of someone eating to fuel rather than to enjoy. Percy ate without speaking. Meg ate while watching Nora, with the unblinking attention of a small animal calculating risk. After the dishes were cleared, Graham sat at the kitchen table with a ledger and a pen, and the expression of a man looking at something that had been bothering him for a long time. Nora dried the last pot and hung it up and said, "Is that the farm's accounts?" He glanced up. "Yes. May I look?" He seemed to consider whether that was a normal thing to ask. Then he pushed the ledger across the table. She sat down and read it carefully. He watched her read it. It took about 10 minutes for her to understand the shape of what she was looking at. The farm had cattle and a small timber operation on the north quarter. Income was inconsistent. Expenses had a pattern she couldn't quite name yet, but something about the outgoing numbers felt off. Not wrong enough to be obvious, but uneven in a way that nagged at her. "Who manages this?" she asked. "I do. When I have time." "When don't you have time?" "Most of the time." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. She looked at a figure from October, then at July, then at March of the previous year. "You're losing more in the 3rd week of the month than any other week," she said. "Every month, fairly consistently." Graham's pen stopped moving. "Feed supplies?" she asked. "Checked out every time. Equipment?" "Same." She closed the ledger and looked at him. "Who signs for deliveries when you're not here?" He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Gordy Price, my foreman." Neither of them said anything else that night. Winter on the Marlowe Farm was not romantic. It was a relentless accumulation of small demands. Fires to bank, water to haul, pipes that froze and needed thawing, animals that needed feeding, regardless of what the temperature was doing outside. Nora learned the rhythms quickly because she had to, and because she was the kind of person who found comfort in having a rhythm to follow. She had the stove burning right by her 2nd week. She learned which pipes froze first. She figured out that Percy liked the porridge with a spoonful of molasses and that Meg ate more if you didn't ask her if she was hungry. The children were not easy. That would have been an inaccurate way to describe them. What they were was grieving, and grief in children looks a great deal like defiance when you're not paying close attention. Percy went silent when he was upset, disappearing into himself in a way that was hard to reach. Meg fought loudly and directly and without much concern for whether the fight was fair. On Nora's 10th day, Meg locked the root cellar door while Nora was down there getting potatoes. She could hear Meg's boots on the floor above her, walking away. She stood in the dark for a few minutes. The root cellar was cold but not dangerous. She could hear the house settling around her. She found a jar of preserves, sat down on the bottom step, and waited. About 40 minutes later, the door opened. Graham stood at the top, holding a lantern. Did she? He started. I was reviewing the shelves, Nora said pleasantly. You're low on pickled beets. He looked at her. Then he reached down a hand and helped her up. She passed him on the stairs. She did not look back to see if Meg was watching. But she heard, from somewhere at the end of the hallway, the sound of a small person letting out a very long breath. That evening, after Percy was in bed, Meg appeared in the kitchen, while Nora was mending a tear in Graham's work coat. I know what you're doing, Meg said. What am I doing? You're being patient, so I'll stop being difficult. So I'll like you. I'm mending your father's coat because there's a hole in it, Nora said. Whether you like me or not is your own business. Meg sat down uninvited at the table. The others wanted us to like them. That sounds exhausting for everyone. A silence. Ma used to mend things, Meg said very quietly, with her eyes on the window. Nora kept her needle moving. When did she pass? 3 years ago. When Percy and I were 7. A pause. Childbed fever. The baby died too. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Meg said it without heat, just the particular tiredness of a child who has received a great deal of condolence and found it mostly useless. I know. Nora bit off her thread. It doesn't help much. Meg looked at her then properly for the first time. Did you lose someone? My mother. November. Is that why you're here? Partly. Another silence. Longer. Then, you don't seem like you're going to cry about it. I did my crying, Nora said. Now I'm doing other things. Meg went to bed without saying good night, but she went. Nora sat with the mended coat and the quiet house and the wind coming off the prairie, and thought that perhaps she understood this child better than she'd expected. She told Graham about Gordie Price on a Saturday morning in February, when the two of them were alone at the kitchen table with coffee and the ledger open between them. She'd spent 3 weeks tracing the numbers. It wasn't complicated once she knew where to look. Every time Graham rode out to the North Quarter, which he did on a rough 3-week rotation to check the timber operation, supplies were short-counted on the return. A quarter load of feed, a discrepancy in the equipment tally, small enough each time to be dismissible, consistent enough over 18 months to add up to something serious. She laid it out in front of him without drama, just the numbers, the dates, the pattern. Graham sat very still while she talked. When she finished, he didn't say anything for long enough that she wondered if she'd made an error. Then he said, 18 months, at least, possibly longer. The records before that are harder to read. He's been with me for 6 years. Nora said nothing. I trusted him. Graham's voice was flat in the way that meant something under it was not flat at all. I know. He stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to her. Outside, the snow was coming down in the slow, inevitable way it did when it had no intention of stopping. You could confront him, she said. Or you could watch. Build more evidence. Take it to the Mounties when it's airtight. What would you do? She thought about it honestly. Watch. A confrontation gives him time to cover his tracks. Evidence is harder to argue with than accusations. He turned around. He was looking at her in the way he occasionally did now, like she was a problem he'd solved but hadn't expected to find interesting. All right, he said. I'll keep the records. Document everything that comes and goes. You tell me when you're going north so I can note the timing. That's more than the job. I know, she closed the ledger. But the job isn't actually working unless the farm does. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Percy asked her, a week later, if she knew how to play checkers. She did. They played 3 games at the kitchen table, while the wind banged against the north wall, and Meg sat nearby pretending to read, and occasionally glancing over at the board. By the second game, Meg had moved her chair 3 inches closer. By the third, she was pointing out moves Percy was missing, which Percy objected to strenuously. Nora watched them argue about checkers, and thought that the house sounded different than it had when she arrived. March came in mean and stayed that way. A late-season storm rolled in from the north and hit hard, and Graham was 3 hours south of the farm at the livestock auction when it arrived. Nora saw it coming in the way the horses acted first. Restless, heads up, ears back, and got the children inside before the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. The storm shut them in for 2 days. The second night, Percy ran a fever. It came on fast, the way fevers do in children. 9 o'clock fine and 10 o'clock burning. She got him into dry clothes and extra blankets and started counting what they had. Willow bark, honey and lemon, the old tin of camphor salve she'd found at the back of the medicine shelf. Not much, not nothing. Meg appeared in the doorway of Percy's room with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, which Nora had learned meant she was frightened. He got sick like this before, Meg said. 2 winters ago. He coughed for 3 weeks. How bad did it get? Bad enough. Nora looked at Percy, who was already half asleep, cheeks flushed wrong. All right, she said. Here's what we're doing. She talked Meg through it steadily. Keep him warm, not hot. Water every hour whether he asked for it or not. She'd handle the night. Meg could take morning. Clear instructions, specific tasks. She'd found that Meg did better with a job than with comfort. Meg nodded and went to fill the water jug. It was a long night. Percy's fever climbed, and she brought it back down, and it climbed again. Around 3 in the morning, she was sitting in the chair beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall, and reminding herself that children fought through this. That he was strong, that the fever hadn't crossed the line into something she couldn't manage, when she heard the front door open downstairs. Graham came up the stairs 2 at a time and appeared in the doorway still wearing his coat, snow on his shoulders, his face the color of a man who has been afraid for several hours and is still afraid. Carson at the Miller farm rode out to tell me, he said, breathing hard. He looked at Percy, then at Nora. How long? Since 10. Fever's been down twice. It keeps coming back, but it's not getting worse than it was at midnight. That's something. He came and stood at the side of the bed and put his hand on Percy's forehead, and something crossed his face that was entirely private and that she looked away from. He sat in the second chair, and they kept the watch together. Around 5 in the morning, Percy's fever broke. He opened his eyes, looked at them both, and said, with the complete pragmatism of a sick child, I'm thirsty. Nora handed him the water jug. She heard Graham exhale beside her, the long, slow exhale of a man putting down something heavy. You should have sent for me sooner, he said. The storm made that impossible, and you know it. She stood up, straightening her back. And I had it in hand. I know. He said it quietly. I know you did. She went downstairs to start the stove. She stood in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn and felt the weight of the night in her legs and her arms and thought, with something that surprised her, this is mine to carry, this family, this farm. I've made it mine without noticing. The thought should have frightened her. It didn't. It was Meg who caught the second part of it. They were hanging laundry in the side room, a week after Percy recovered, and Meg said out of nowhere, Gordy Price was in the south barn again. Nora stopped. When? Yesterday. When Pa was mending the east fence. Meg paused, folding a shirt with more care than she usually gave laundry. He was in there a long time. Then he took the small wagon out the back gate. Did you see what was in it? Feed sacks. But they weren't our sacks. They were already on the wagon when he went in. Nora thought about this very carefully. Meg, you're certain? I'm not blind. The girl looked at her steadily. I've been watching him. Since you and Pa started talking about the ledger, I figured. She shrugged with one shoulder. Figured someone should. Nora looked at this 10-year-old girl and felt something that was somewhere between gratitude and a very specific kind of respect. Don't tell your father yet, she said. I need to write down what you saw exactly, with the date and time. Can you remember every detail? Yes, good. Then we do this right. When the case against Gordy Price was finally solid enough, 3 more months of careful documentation, a quiet conversation with Corporal Aiken of the Northwest Mounted Police, a second witness in one of the other ranch hands who'd been uncomfortable for months and needed only to be asked directly. Graham brought it to the Mounties in mid-June. Price was arrested on a Thursday. Graham came home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and didn't say much. Nora put food in front of him, and he ate without tasting it, and she understood that it wasn't the theft he was sitting with, so much as the years of trust that turned out to have been misplaced. You feel like a fool, she said. He glanced up. That's not what you are, she said. A person who trusts his people isn't a fool. That's just a man running a farm. Graham was quiet for a moment. You found it in 3 weeks. I was looking at it fresh. You were looking at a man you'd known for 6 years. She poured his coffee and set it down. That's different. He looked at her in the way she'd grown used to, that measured look that she'd once found impenetrable and now understood was simply how he processed things, slowly, carefully, without showing his working until it was done. Nora, he said, if you're about to thank me again, I wasn't. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I was going to say that I don't know what this place would have done without you this winter, and I'm not. He stopped, tried again. I'm not easy to work for. I know that. I'm not much for conversation, and I lose track of things when the farm takes all of it, and the kids, they need more than I know how to give them. And you came here with nothing and built something anyway. Rebuilt it. He set the cup down. I wanted to say that I see it. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside, the June evening was long and gold, the prairie open and wide and indifferent in its beauty. Thank you, she said, for saying it. They sat in the kitchen while the light changed, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd been in since before her mother got sick. The summer was better. The farm felt like itself again, or perhaps like a better version of itself. Price's replacement turned out to be a young man named Boyd, who was diligent and honest and intimidated by Nora in a way she found privately useful. The cattle operation steadied. The timber quarter started showing proper returns. The south fence got repaired. The barn door no longer hung at its miserable angle. The children grew. Percy shot up 3 inches and developed a serious interest in the horses. Meg stopped testing Nora and started asking her things instead. Real questions. The kind you only ask someone you've decided to trust. What do you do when you're frightened and no one can see it? How do you know when to keep going and when to stop? The kinds of questions her mother used to answer, and that had been going unanswered for 3 years. Nora answered them as honestly as she could. She had been frightened in that root cellar, she said, though not seriously. She kept going because stopping meant being somewhere worse, and that was most of the logic available to her. She had not always been sure when to stop. She still wasn't. That's not a very reassuring answer, Meg said. No, Nora agreed. But it's the real one. Meg seemed to find this more satisfying than something comforting would have been. One evening in late August, Graham was in the barn, and the children were in bed, and Nora was sitting on the porch step watching the last color leave the sky, when he came and sat beside her. Not at the other end of the step. Beside her. They sat for a while without talking. Meg asked me something yesterday, he said finally. What did she ask? She asked if I was planning to marry you. Nora kept her eyes on the horizon. What did you tell her? I told her I hadn't asked. A pause. She told me I was taking too long. Nora laughed before she could stop herself. It came out quiet and real, and she let it. She's not wrong, usually, she said. Graham turned to look at her. Up close, in the last of the light, he looked less like the man she'd met in the alley behind the feed store, and more like the man he was underneath the long winter. Tired, yes, but present. Paying attention. I'm not easy to be married to either, he said. I should say that. You're not easy to work for, she agreed. You don't talk enough and you assume too much and you forget to eat when you're in the field. Yes, and she asked. And he looked back at the sky. I haven't wanted to ask someone something this large since Catherine. And she died and it almost broke everything. And I spent a long time not wanting anything that could do that again. He was quiet. And then you showed up in the alley with your trunk and your practical face, and you've been making the impossible ordinary every day since. And somewhere in that, I started wanting again, whether I meant to or not. Nora thought about that. About arriving in January with $7 and the weight of an empty life behind her. About the root cellar and the fever nights and the ledger spread across the kitchen table. About Meg asking real questions and Percy finally looking up from his boots. About this. How a person could arrive at the bottom of everything and find it was, improbably, somewhere. Yes, she said. Yes to which part? Yes to all of it. She turned to look at him. Including the part where you're difficult and don't talk enough. I know what I'm saying yes to. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he took her hand, which was not something he'd done before, and held it with the same careful steadiness he applied to things he intended to keep. I can try to talk more, he said. I'll believe it when I hear it. He didn't quite smile, but close. They married in October, before the hard weather came back. Small and simple. The children, Boyd, a couple of neighbors, a minister who rode out from the town and ate 3 helpings of the meal. Meg had insisted on helping cook, and which she was very proud of and had earned the right to be. Meg wore her mother's brooch. Percy read something from a passage their mother had marked in the family Bible, in a clear voice without wavering, and Nora felt that moment settle into her like something permanent. At the table afterward, Meg sat close enough to lean against Nora's arm, which was as close as Meg ever came to saying something she couldn't quite put into words. The winter that followed was hard, the way prairie winters are, without apology or comfort. But the farm held, the house held. The stove burned properly, and the fires were banked right, and in the mornings there was enough of everything to keep going. Nora learned that the Northwest Territories did not accommodate weakness, did not slow down for grief, did not offer second chances in any form that looked like mercy. It only offered tomorrow, and the chance to try again in it, and the people willing to try alongside you. She had arrived with nothing. She had built something anyway, not because she'd been given the materials for it, but because she'd looked at what was in front of her and refused to treat it as less than enough. The land outside was white and enormous and entirely indifferent. She drank her coffee and watched it, and felt, very quietly, that she was exactly where she was meant to be.